You're watching the Merged Marketing Podcast. You're listening to the Merged Marketing Podcast. And today I'm here with Jim Heininger, and we're talking about rebranding and overcoming the challenges in a rebrand. And I think Jim is an excellent guest for this episode. Jim, welcome to the show. How you doing?
Good. It's nice to be with you.
Awesome. Jim's coming to us from Chi-Town, Chicago. And first and foremost, before we get into the whole topic of rebranding, maybe tell us a bit about your journey, Jim, and what brought you to where you are today.
You bet. So I spent about 25 years in the global PR agency environment, working on a number of big blue chip brands and kind of their strategic communications and positioning. Went to McDonald's Corporation then for several years as a just kind of a communications consultant. And when a lot of those projects were finished, I wanted to go back into the agency world, and they said, only if you open your own firm and we're allowed to continue to do work with you. So I happily agreed and opened my own business. And a few years later, after doing several rebrandings, we decided that there was really kind of a unique combination of capabilities that companies needed when they rebranded to do it successfully. And it was all these things like change management and executive coaching and employee engagement. So we spun off a separate firm called Rebranding Experts that focuses solely on helping organizations through that kind of journey transformation.
Nice. Okay. And that brings you where today. You've done a bit of businesses here north of the border as well.
Sure, yeah.
So that's interesting. So I think one of the big questions that a lot of businesses might have is, when is the right time for a rebrand? Because I think some businesses and brands engage in a rebrand when they don't have to, and some just wait it out too long and miss the opportunity when they need to.
Yeah, so there's probably some questions you should ask yourself if you're thinking about rebranding, and that focuses around, is the brand working as hard as it should be out in the marketplace? Is it holding you back in any ways from being able to meet your growth expectations, your reaching into new customer segments or building the kind of following that you want? And third is, what happens if we don't rebrand? What are the repercussions of it? And that's where I think you get into that issue of waiting too long, perhaps. We always encourage clients to go through a rebranding business case and building out all the kind of good factual information and emotional support as to why you should rebrand. And then that makes leadership much more supportive of the effort as it rolls forward.
When you talk about the why, can you give some insight into the kind of questions that you would ask to elicit that why answer, as to, because I think a lot of people don't understand why they would need it in the first place.
Right. We actually did a little studying on this and came to the kind of simple conclusion that there's two buckets of reasons that organizations rebrand. One is need, and the second is opportunity. Need is things like we've merged, or we've been acquired, or we have we've got a requirement to figure out what the brand is going to be going forward because of a structural change, and therefore have a need to rebrand. And that's oftentimes driven as well by that brand just no longer working in the marketplace. It's holding you back. It's stale. It's old. Then opportunity is for those organizations that are really have mapped out a good new strategic growth plan. They've got a new strategy going forward. They're going to expand geographically. They want to enter into new markets or customer segments, and that previous brand is just not going to work in that setting. And so they need to come up with a new brand to be able to support it. So usually falls in those two buckets, need or opportunity.
It's interesting because it touches close to home right now for our business, for our agency. 3 years ago, when we came up with our brand and our logo and the branding kit and all that, we were 80% male. We were kind of a boys club, and our clientele were very much driven through that as well. So we were driving a lot of like automotive businesses, landscaping businesses, things like that. And now, not even by design, but fast forward to today, and we're 80% women. And so now we're having this conversation around, well, what does a rebrand look like for us? Is it changing a few colors in the logo to make it maybe a little more appealing to a female demographic, or is it a brand overhaul? So is there a degree to how far you can go with a rebrand?
Yeah, it definitely is. And we look at it as kind of three different levels. There's what we would call a brand refresh, which would be that visual makeover of a brand. It's perhaps a new logo, a new visual identity, and maybe some updated language that kind of conveys who you are. That's a brand refresh. Then you see a lot of companies that go through what we would call a brand repositioning. And that's where they're really needing to change up how they go to market, who they're trying to approach, what the customer is today, and then maybe their customer set has changed. We're seeing that a lot within the retail environment. You've got major retailers like Abercrombie and Fitch and Victoria's Secret that have been going through these kind of major repositionings the last couple of years because the way they were going to market got very quickly outdated and current customers weren't having it anymore. Now, they haven't changed necessarily their name, though, or their visual identity. And that's what we would roll up to the very top level, which is a full rebrand. And that's where you're standing up an entirely new brand, beginning with your customer promise, but then also like changing the name of the organization, changing the culture of the organization to deliver on a new customer experience that brand now represents. So that's a much more comprehensive, detailed, and certainly requires a lot more resources to be able to accomplish.
I find that's always risky to take that leap to actually change the brand name for several reasons. I mean, we're a social media SEO digital marketing company, right? So when we have, for example, a dental practice will come to us and be like, "Well, we just purchased this practice that's been around for 40 years, and we're gonna call it something else, Smiles Dental or whatever you want to
Yep.
call it." And we're always kind of like, "Well, wait a second here. You have that domain that's been sitting there for 40 years. It's
Mhm.
got a lot of authority with Google. Let's hold that thought for a second." So I'm sure there are some hesitancy for doing that full out rebrand where you're changing the name, but in some cases, it probably makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, and there are many steps that you can take to try to maintain that credibility for your current domain, and obviously it's going to transfer to a new domain that you would launch. But it, I think it always comes down to what's the sense of promise that current brand delivers versus what you could define as a new one going forward. And is it much more compelling? Is it much more relevant to today's, potential customer? And therefore, is it worth that leap going forward versus just hanging on to the past?
So what kind of impact does social media have in the whole landscape of a rebrand? Right? Like maybe you can give some insight into that. And is that something that is worth considering when you're rebranding? Is how you're going to be reflected on those social channels?
Oh, you definitely need to have that kind of strategy in place, and how prior to launching your rebrand, how do you start to generate some kind of interest and intrigue in what you're up to, so that you've captured kind of the attention and a little bit of anticipation going into your announcement, among all your followers. Then you have to launch a new, you can upgrade across many social platforms to your new name now, to your new platform, and you need to have a very deliberate, thought leadership plan or outreach kind of effort on that new platform now, that really conveys a different kind of experience than what people have had with you in the past. That's what people expect in a rebrand, is something different, not just more the same with a new name on top of it. That we call that just putting lipstick on the pig. There has to be something different, substantially different, to the way you do your business, the way you interact with customers, so that they feel like they're being brought forward into to exciting new company.
Let's talk about some of those assets that are involved in changing a rebrand. Obviously, you have the branding kit, the color codes, the logo, business cards. What are some? Do you have like a checklist of items that need to follow suit when you go through that rebrand?
Yeah, you bet we do. And it's well over 300 different assets that we'll go walk through with a company to say these are things that are going to need to reflect your name change, because oftentimes it's a legal corporate name change. And so, legal documents and employment agreements all need to be updated. Bank accounts, insurance policies, a lot of different kind of behind the scenes business documentation is going to need to be updated, so that you don't find yourself in some kind of awkward position going forward. One of the things that we found through this process is to pretty soon after we start the engagement, and before we even come up with the new brand and that, what we're going to propose to them, is to start that process of auditing all those different assets. Because what companies often find is the more assets that they have, the higher the price tag of changing those. And all of a sudden they get halfway through the rebranding and begin to realize, oh boy, we've got staff uniforms, we've got vehicles out on the road, we've got signage on buildings. I didn't stop to think that that's all going to need to be updated, and the cost can start to, definitely exceed what they had originally anticipated. So we start that early on now, because we don't want it to derail the rebranding or have them having to make, some uncomfortable compromises later because they just didn't budget enough for it.
I think that's so critical, just having that transparency up front of being like, this is what it's gonna cost for the full rebrand. Like on the high end, even on the high end, so they know it. So they're knowing that they're in that ballpark when it comes to, like, we're talking about uniforms and car wraps and things like that.
Yeah.
Like that can get crazy, crazy expensive. And you don't want to half-ass it, right? So you got to go all in, right?
Yep.
So are there some other mistakes that you find that people make when they go through the process of doing a rebrand without an expert like you on their side?
Well, so we actually did a survey a few years back when we launched the business, because we wanted to understand what were the challenges that companies, the clients, were going to be having, that we needed to build capabilities around. All the obstacles that they identified were internal. So it was getting leadership engagement and support of what they were trying to do, getting all the different department heads at the table in kind of a cross-functional effort to make sure that they were doing what they needed to in their respective areas of the business to support the rebranding, getting the employees engaged, and then working to build a culture that would support the new brand promise. Because if there were things that were going to need to be done from even your customer service team or anybody that was interacting with external stakeholders, that they knew what they were supposed to do. So it was really, really helpful, because that's when we stood up the capabilities like executive coaching and employee engagement. We use a lot of change management in our rebrandings, because at the end of the day, rebranding is meant to signal a change in the way you're doing business. And so how do you get the organization to pivot to be able to support that change? So most of those obstacles were internal. They weren't the traditional marketing pieces that we think of, as in, new language or logo or look and feel or packaging. It was, how do we get the organization to rebrand successfully?
Let's dig into that for a second, because I'm very curious how you go about, or if there's a process in place to get an entire organization or the management of an organization on board. What have you seen works best?
So it's very much a top-down kind of process or cascade. We require the leadership of the organization to be involved in the decision, not only to rebrand, but in selecting the new brand. We don't leave it to just the marketing department or even just the CEO or the owner or founder of the company. The leadership team has to be at the table, because that's the only way we have found that they will have a stake in the new effort, and that they then realize their responsibility in championing that new brand with their employees, with their teams as it goes forward. It's, we found many organizations where we start into that process, and a lot of these leaders, they don't even know what a brand is. Did we have a brand? Why are we needing a new brand? So there's a lot of just basic education up front of what is a brand, how does it work on behalf of your business, what are brands you like, and that you see the obvious connection to what it does for that particular company and its success. Then they start to get it a little bit more. Okay, now I understand what a brand is. Now I understand what our current brand is and where we're trying to shift to. Now I can be a better advocate for it as we go forward. So then it's a cascade down. It's then, the middle management layers, and then the employees at all levels. We will produce training, modules for them to be able to kind of train the trainer on down, so that they perceive that their leaders are supporting the rebranding. that they know how to talk about it. They know how to answer questions from customers or even their own families as to, well, what's this new brand stand for? And then they're confident by launch day to be able to support it when it goes live. So it's a very kind of calculated effort all the way down. And it really requires the organization doing its part. We'll guide them through that, but they have to own and embrace that if they want the desired outcome, which is a successful launch.
I'm a big proponent of having, as an advertiser on social, I'm a big proponent of having a business or brand have a brand ambassador, be the face of the brand that's familiar with that audience that we're trying to get in front of, and increase in that ad frequency, which is how many times people are seeing that person. Is there a parallel with having that brand ambassador or a new brand ambassador on board with the rebrand at the same time?
So a couple thoughts. We will, as part of this kind of cascade of internal support that we're trying to generate before the brand goes live, one technique you can use is to reach out to those kind of informal influencers within the company and ask them, bring them in a little bit early, show them what you're doing, ask them to be, active supporters and conveyors of communication out to their respective employee groups, so that you've got the people that employees will naturally turn to say, what do you think of this? And are you on board? And you've already kind of prepped them and you put them in a position to be successful at responding to that. It's also important externally, if you have influencers in your industry, if you have your own set of influencers that you're on any kind of paid relationship with, that they be brought in enough time to be told of what's happening so that they aren't taken by surprise, that they can support it the minute you make your announcement. You don't have to give them a tremendous amount of time, but you need to prep them for success so that they can be able to support you going forward as well too. Nothing worse than, if there's an industry where there's some, super noted, experts in the field and so forth, and the minute you make your announcement, a reporter calls them to say, what do you think? And they said, I have no idea what you're talking about. What they do, give them just even a few hours heads up as to what you're up to, so that they're informed, they can look smart when others in the industry reach out to say, what's your take on this?
Obviously, with the whole shift that's happened over the last couple of years, with a lot of businesses going online, a lot of businesses going through struggles, I'm assuming there's huge amounts of trends in the rebranding industry that you're seeing a big influx of brands wanting to rebrand. Is that true? And is that a direct cause of the pandemic?
So great question. Hanover did some research in 2020 that 70% of businesses had made changes with their brand. Up City just came out with a new report in the last several months that said during or as a result of the pandemic, 51% of businesses had changed their brand in some way. So clearly there's a consciousness that we have to, your brand always needs to be relevant and up to date and so forth. And so perhaps a little bit more willingness to be able to make those changes, especially when your customer set and the external environment has changed the way it did during the pandemic. What's really interesting is that 78% of the business executives that Hanover talked to said, we got a direct result out of rebranding. It helps, clarify your positioning to your customer base. It helps you optimize your messaging. It helps grow the organization. And that's, the end of the day, that's what rebranding has got to be about, is a growth accelerator. That's the only reason you would go through this and spend the money and the time and the resources, is if it's going to lift sales and drive revenue going forward.
I think that's a big intangible, is the fact that a rebrand excites employees, excites the owners, excites the sales team, because it's new and it's fresh, right? I think there's an element to that as well, that just, it's exciting. A rebrand is exciting and it's a fresh start, and everybody likes a fresh start.
Right. Especially if they realize it's going to make their efforts more successful, if it's going to help grease the wheels with customer relationships and so forth. It's interesting though, usually the number one audience internally that is most resistant to a rebrand is sales. because they're worried it's disrupting the relationship that they've built with customers. It's going to confuse them. They don't want things to get in the way of that relationship. And so we have found them to be perhaps, the ones that stick their heels in the sand a little bit more,
Mm.
require more training and coaching on how to tell the new brand story, how to make sure that they know, what to reach out to their customer with and tell them what, about. This is probably more in a B2B setting, but how to leverage it to be able to grow relationships as opposed to being worried that it's going to upset those kind of relationships.
As a salesperson, I have a history in sales, and I can understand that. I can totally empathize with that because, I mean, it looks wishy-washy to a prospect. The fact that you might be going through a rebrand, and I mean, a salesperson's word, they're as good as a word, right? So if something changes, it's kind of a surprise. I think the thought is it might leave a bad taste in a prospect's mouth,
Or it
right?
wasn't good enough. Why? I've been doing work with you for years, and you weren't good enough. You had to do this. No,
Right.
yeah.
100%. That's interesting. Very interesting. Maybe give a quick definition or what's the difference between a brand refresh and a rebrand?
So we look at a refresh as being a visual makeover of a brand. So new logo, new look and feel of it a little bit more. A rebrand, we would roll up to being an entirely new customer promise. That's a new customer experience and a new name that illustrates visually that new promise to customers. So it's a changing the name of the organization.
Awesome. Jim, this has been great. If our audience has any questions for you, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
So reach out. We're at rebrandingexperts.com, the same on all the social platforms, and you can look for me on LinkedIn. We publish a lot of kind of thought leadership that we think is helpful to organizations that are considering if a rebrand is appropriate for them or not.
Awesome. Jim, we end every episode with the same question. That question is this: if you can choose one person, dead or alive, to represent your brand, who would it be and why?
Oh, you should have given me a little time to think about that one. That's a good question. Well, I would say we are used to seeing so many celebrities rebrand themselves and do so fairly successfully. Changing to remain relevant to the times. I'm just going to throw out a couple, like maybe Dolly Parton. She's one that is always current. Even Madonna has gone through all those kind of major changes that are necessary to keep herself relevant. So Dolly and Madonna.
I love that. I love that. But we didn't that's a whole nother episode talking about personal branding, personal rebrands and celebrity rebrands. But
Yep.
how does a Dolly Parton or Madonna rebrand? Does that mean just changing their style of music, changing their fashion? What does that entail?
I all the above, and kind of where they show up, and how they show up. I think is because that's what celebrities do. Is where they are seen and their pictures taken and captured and so forth. So it's what you say, but it's also what you do in your actions.
Awesome. Jim, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, my pleasure.